For centuries, life in Europe was dictated by the rigid class system of feudalism and the constant struggle for survival. When the Black Death struck, it devastated the population, but as the plague began to recede, it left behind a significantly changed landscape. This massive loss of life had inadvertently weakened the grip of feudalism, creating more social and economic breathing room for those who remained. As a sense of stability returned, people began to feel more optimistic about the future, finally allowing them to turn their attention from sheer survival toward the pursuit of new ways of thinking. However, pursuing these new ideas required more than just interest. It required time and resources. Building grand architecture, inventing complex machines, or dedicating years to study meant that someone had to have enough surplus wealth to pay for it. To find that wealth, we have to look to the Italian peninsula. This map shows how Italy sits at a strategic intersection, positioned directly between Europe, North Africa, and the trade hubs of the Byzantine and Ottoman empires. Because of this geography, Italy became a central crossroads for the region. This position allowed Italian merchants to intercept global trade routes and accumulate the capital necessary to fund a new era of human history. External forces helped open these channels. The Crusades put European merchants in contact with Arab traders, and the Mongol Empire eventually secured the Silk Road. As a result, goods like Chinese silk and Indian spices began reaching Europe more reliably and at lower costs. Italy's port cities acted as the primary gateway for these goods. Merchants bought these luxury items at the source and sold them across Western Europe for much higher prices, concentrating wealth in the hands of a few powerful city-states. The Republic of Venice capitalized on its coastal geography by building a city on islands supported by wooden posts. They replaced roads with canals, turning the city into a major shipbuilding center that could dominate maritime trade between Europe and Asia. While Venice ruled the sea, Florence built its wealth inland. They started by importing English wool to produce high-quality cloth, but the real power came when families like the Medici moved into banking, opening offices across Europe. These bankers charged interest on loans and managed currency exchanges for traders. They used a specific gold coin, stamped with a lily, as a standard to measure the value of money from different countries, making Florentine bankers some of the wealthiest people in Europe. By the mid-1300s, this monopoly on trade and finance allowed merchants and bankers to rise to positions of power. They formed a new ruling class in the cities, effectively replacing the old land-based influence of the medieval nobles. These new merchant rulers lacked the royal bloodlines of traditional kings, so they used their wealth to establish their legitimacy. They competed with one another to make their cities most impressive, hiring artists and architects to create works signaling their power. They looked to the ancient past for their models. Surrounded by the ruins and statues of the Roman Empire, Italian artists and scholars used these ancient examples as a standard for their own work, sparking a renewed interest in Greek and Roman culture. This shift changed how people viewed human achievement. Scholars began to focus on secular ideas, those related to the world and human activities outside of religion. They started to believe that individuals had the power to change the world through their own work. This engineering prowess was physically proven in Florence. Architect Filippo Brunelleschi designed a massive freestanding dome for the city's cathedral. By basing his design on ancient Roman engineering, he completed the structure without using supporting arches, a feat that amazed his contemporaries. The Renaissance was the result of this competitive drive. Rival cities took the wealth they gained from trade and turned it into a concentrated effort to revive the art, science, and architecture of antiquity. Inside these wealthy city-states, politics was a complex struggle for control. Rulers had to manage unrest among the poor while preventing other powerful families from seizing their government, often relying on diplomacy to keep the peace between states. To navigate this environment, diplomat Niccolò Machiavelli wrote The Prince. He argued that a ruler's primary goal was to maintain the state and keep power, suggesting that leaders must prioritize pragmatism over traditional morality to ensure their city's survival. While these ideas were taking hold in Italy, a new invention ensured they wouldn't stay there. Around 1450, Johannes Gutenberg developed the printing press, a machine that could produce books faster and at a much lower cost than hand copying. Italian wealth provided the initial spark for these new ways of thinking, but the printing press acted as the engine for their spread. It transformed a local cultural shift into a movement that reached every corner of Europe. The economic impact of the press was immediate. As books became cheaper, they were no longer restricted to the wealthy or the clergy. This increased access to information led to a greater exchange of ideas between people across the continent. Before the press, most learned people read and wrote in Latin, but printers began publishing works in everyday local languages. This allowed more people to read on their own, rather than depending on scholars to translate or explain texts to them. This shift had significant consequences for the church. When people could read the Bible in their own language, they began to form their own ideas about faith. This directly challenged the authority of church officials and led to calls for reform across Europe. This skepticism also changed the study of the natural world. Instead of relying on medieval assumptions, scientists began to follow a clear process. They would observe nature closely, record what they saw, and test their ideas through a structured process. This chain of events, from the trade of Asian goods to the mass printing of books, altered the distribution of power. As merchant wealth grew and information became public, the old system of feudalism faded, moving influence away from noble bloodlines and toward the reasoning and observations of the individual.